Welcome back, everybody. My name is Tucker, and today is the highly anticipated What's Next video for the San Antonio Spurs, or at least by this guy that's commented on literally everything I've posted on Instagram over the last few weeks about where the Spurs What's Next video is. Well, here it is. In this season, things were pretty much the same as they were last year for the Spurs. They almost won 50 games. They lost in the first round of the playoffs, and in the Western Conference, that's nothing to complain about, although it's a little bit strange that they didn't have as good of a record this year as they did the year before, despite the fact that they had value on the floor for Kawhi Leonard when they didn't have that last year. But there's other factors for that, and they still had a solid season. But the question for this group is not going to be how do they continue to be solid moving forward. It's how do they potentially get themselves into championship contention, with the Western Conference potentially changing a lot next year. If Kevin Durant ends up leaving, there's going to be a lot of other teams outside of the top 2 or 3 in the West from this year that are going to be looking at this situation and saying, how do we get ourselves up there to at least give ourselves a chance? And the Spurs are going to be one of those teams. Now, I don't know how likely it is that the Spurs are actually going to become championship contenders, but it does at least appear as though, as always, they have a plan moving forward for as long as Gregg Popovich wants to continue to coach, and then once he stops coaching and retires, they do have some alternatives as well to kind of focus on the young guys. So let's go ahead and see what's next for the San Antonio Spurs. But as always, let's talk first about some building blocks. First is going to be Demar Derozan, who had a solid season with the Spurs, fits well within their system as one of the very few guys that still takes a lot of mid-range jumpers and doesn't take a lot of threes as a perimeter player. Like I said, fits well with them, is on a relatively fair deal through 2021, and even showed growth this year as a playmaker in the few spurts throughout the season that the Spurs look to be a really, really good team. So he fits well with them, is going to be with them until at least 2021, and is a really good player for them, although maybe not, an all-NBA caliber guy at this point. Next is Lamarcus Aldridge, who actually led the team in scoring just barely over DeRozan. He's obviously a very good post scorer and a pretty good floor spacer despite not being a big-time three-point shooter, and he should continue to produce at a borderline all-star level for the remaining 2 years of his contract in San Antonio, although there are some slight wrinkles with his deal that I'm going to talk about later. And last in the veteran category before I get to some of the younger guys is Rudy Gay, who actually had one of his best seasons in the league this past year, certainly his most efficient scoring season, shooting over 50% from the field and over 40% from 3 for the first time in his entire career. And although he has had some injury issues in the past, he did end up playing nearly 70 games this season and should be a solid piece for whatever team he plays on moving forward, because he is a 2019 free agent. But I would imagine that assuming Gregg Popovich comes back to coach next year and the priority is still to try and compete for as high of a playoff seed as they possibly can, they're going to want to try and bring Rudy Gay back next year. And now we get to some of the younger guys, and first up is Deshante Murray, who did not play for the Spurs at all this season after having an impressive 2017-18 season and at some point becoming the starting point guard of the future for the Spurs. He's an above average defender with good length that can get to the rim and make plays for others, but he needs to become a more efficient playmaker as well as scorer, and obviously improve a ton as a shooter to be a really, really big piece for this team. And it'll be interesting to see how he recovers from the knee injury that kept him out of the entire year, but this is the Spurs. This is a young player that showed a good amount of promise, especially in his second season, so he should be at the very least solid for them and potentially has some high upside as a backcourt player. Next up is Derrick, who actually got a lot of attention in the postseason with some of his performances in that series against the Nuggets, and he's a really good young player, but he was actually only their 6th leading scorer during the regular season and certainly still has strides to make, even though he did show so much promise. Having said that, he's a bigger guard that's an efficient playmaker and scorer and a pretty good defender, and as long as he works on getting to the free throw line a little bit more and becoming a better shooter, him and DeJounte Murray should form a pretty good backcourt pairing moving forward, as long as their games coalesce, because we haven't actually seen them on the floor together to this point. And then the other two guys I want to mention very briefly are Bryn Forbes and Jakob Poeltl. Forbes is a really good shooter, but hasn't really shown to be anything other than just a shooting specialist at this point. And Poeltl also, has shown some promise, but isn't necessarily anything to be too excited about, and is just a solid rotation big at this point. And now we move on to free agency, and the Spurs are actually in a pretty good spot. They're going to be at $97 million in payroll for next season as of right now, which gives them about $10 million in space. And really their only significant free agent is going to be Rudy Gay, and they have Lamarcus Aldridge and Demar Derozan under team control for at least the next 2 seasons, assuming that Derozan doesn't opt out of his player option in 2020 and that they don't buy out Lamarcus Aldridge's contract in that same summer as well, which is something I'm going to talk about a little bit later. So for next season, they could very easily bring back the same group that they just had, using up most of, if not all, their cap space to bring back Rudy Gay, and then using the mid-level exception to bring in a little bit more wing and shooting help. And then obviously with the addition of Murray, someone that they didn't have all last season because of injury, if he comes back and plays as well or better than he did in his second season, that would be a big boost for this team, because they definitely need a little bit more help on the perimeter in terms of bigger guards and wings, especially defensively. Now, as I get to the second option, they certainly could just let Rudy Gay walk and potentially replace him with that $10 million in cap space with a younger player. But given their priorities that they've shown in the past, going back to the Kawhi Leonard trade, that they're still trying to be as good as they can now and not so much focused on a youth movement, I would expect them to bring back Gay. But again, the second option would be to let him walk and have that $10 million in space. Now, they can do whatever they want with that, but they really have to wait until 2020, until next offseason, to have any kind of real significant cap space. And once some of their bigger contracts come off the books, they'd have over $30 million in space in the 2020 offseason. But the problem is both Poeltl and Murray would be up for new contracts themselves, and that would take up a fairly significant amount of their space depending on those players' performances this year because of their new deals if they wanted to bring them back. Now, there are some wrinkles in this because, as you can see, Demar Derozan has a player option for 2020, and the little italicized salary for Lamarcus Aldridge means that his contract is non-guaranteed, and the Spurs can buy out his contract for a very, very small dead cap number and open up even more cap space. So really all this kind of depends on what Gregg Popovich wants to do, because the team has shown that if he wants to continue coaching, they're going to continue as a front office to put out a team that's going to at least compete for a relatively high playoff seed in the Western Conference, rather than prioritizing some of their younger players and maybe going a little bit more towards a rebuilding movement. So if Popovich wants to continue to coach in 2020 and beyond, I would imagine that they would keep DeRozan, they would keep Aldridge, and just continue to try and run it back with relatively the same group and use some of that cap space left over in 2020 to just continue to build on what they have over the last couple of seasons of Popovich's career. On the other hand, if this ends up being his last season or he doesn't want to coach beyond 2020, I could see a scenario in which maybe DeRozan opts out to get a long-term deal. They let him walk, they buy out Aldridge's contract, and suddenly they're looking at $50+ million in cap space in the summer of 2020, and then also considering that they have to bring back Murray and Poeltl, even after that, they're going to have a ton of space and flexibility to kind of do what they want to. So they'd have that core of whatever Lonnie Walker ends up being, plus Murray and Poeltl and White, and then whatever they do with the 19th and 20th picks in this draft, because they have Toronto's pick this year as a result of the Kawhi trade, and then they kind of move forward with that core. Now, the issue there is I don't really know that they have an all-NBA caliber player in that group. I mean, maybe Murray or White really surprises people and continues to develop the way players typically do in San Antonio, but that would be an issue with that potential rebuilding plan. Not only is it not something that they've typically shown to do and probably won't do as long as Popovich is still the coach, but it's also something that I don't really know how well they're going to be able to develop an all-NBA caliber guy. And really, they have a ton of complementary options, but don't really have the stars for a rebuilding project. So it would be something probably more longer term to try and do that, to try and find a higher draft pick to be their star of the future. So it's a little bit iffy there, but that's way, way down the line. In terms of an immediate sense, at least the Spurs, as always, like I said in the beginning, seem to have some kind of plan, and it's going to depend on what Gregg Popovich wants to do. They can run it back with basically the same group next year, re-sign Rudy Gay, or potentially replace him with a younger option if they wanted to. They have the addition of Deshante Murray coming back from injury to add to last year's team that was very successful considering the changes they went through roster-wise, and they should be able to compete for like a 6, a 5, or a 4 seed in the Western Conference next year with the addition of Murray, running it back with that same group. And then 2020 is going to kind of be the what's going to happen next offseason, or potentially 2021. Because let's just say that we get to 2020 and Pop says that he wants to coach one more season. They can certainly still keep DeRozan if he opts in. They cannot buy out Aldridge. Both of those guys' contracts would run out the following offseason. They can bring back Murray and Poeltl, still have a little bit of cap space left over to kind of build around those two guys in this current core that they have. So either way, the Spurs are going to be okay. But the problem is, I don't really see how they get to championship contention with any of the pieces that they currently have, unless something drastic happens with the development of Murray or White or whoever they pick up in this draft. And they also don't really have a ton of assets to be able to make some kind of crazy move for a star, or really the cap space to do that either moving forward. But at the same time, this is the path that they chose when they decided to take the package for Kawhi Leonard that they did, because there were certainly other options on the table, options that resulted in a team that was younger, potentially had a higher ceiling, but they decided to go with DeRozan and Poeltl and a pick. And in the end, maybe that's going to end up being the wrong decision for the long-term future of this team. I understand that they wanted to keep a competitive team on the roster for Gregg Popovich, and that's certainly what he wanted, and he has a big say within the organization. But looking back on it, as Kawhi is turning into possibly the best player in the entire league, could they have gotten more out of that trade that would help them in the long term? Because once DeRozan's deal is up, it doesn't really look like Poeltl is going to turn into anything hugely significant, and then the 29th pick this year isn't likely to be either. So what really are they going to end up getting long term for Kawhi? Doesn't really seem like it's going to be all that much, and we could look back on that as a mistake. But at least in the short term, they have a plan. They know what they're going to do. It depends a little bit beyond 2020 and 2021 on what Gregg Popovich wants to do, but they do, at least unlike many teams around the league, have a plan. And that is something to be proud of and be hopeful of for Spurs fans, even though I personally don't think they're going to be a championship contender anytime in the next 3 or 4, maybe even 5 seasons. And there you have it. That is going to be the end of today's video, and I thank you all very much for watching. Once again, my name is Tucker. If you missed any of my previous videos, then be sure to check out the boxes on screen. Thanks again, and I'll see you all next time.